Alright, so I'm going to end this lecture by, or I guess I'm going to end this entire reading group by talking about the legacy of Trotskyism. So, there's the or actually, give me 1 second. Spin. So there's because I think I made sure I put a note here. So the orthodox understanding of the legacy of Trotskyism is that, let's see here. Yeah. So yeah, the orthodox understanding of the legacy of Trotskyism is, orthodox Trotskyism, which you'll find with like the Spartacus League, for example. I'm trying to think of any other with anyone who considers themselves like a Canaanite today. Well, actually, I'm not sure if there's really. I think the Spartacus League is the only surviving organization in the world which would call itself Trotskyist. But even now, I think it's kind of degraded, and even in that understanding. But the orthodox Trotskyists will, describe Trotskyism, or they will define Trotskyism as program, right? They'll say that Trotskyism is, what is Trotskyism? Trotskyism is the first 4 congresses of the Communist International. They will say that it's the transitional program. They will say that it's, it is workers' democracy against the bureaucratic degeneration of the Soviet Union. They will describe it as it is the principle of permanent revolution, and it's an opposition to socialism in one country. If you search up Trotskyism on Wikipedia, for example, or on the internet, this is usually the definition of Trotskyism that you're going to get. It reduces Trotsky to a set of principles, to a program, essentially. So this is one understanding of Trotskyism, but in some sense, this is we've been talking about this problem with reification, of this kind of ossification of Marxism. We've described that as kind of the characteristic of Stalinism, right? Or this characteristic of opportunism, this kind of when it tries to create a historical dynamic, or it tries to reify some sort of historical dynamic into into an ism or into a thing or something like that, right? So this orthodox understanding of Trotskyism is, interestingly enough, pretty Stalinist, because it's pretty programmatic, right? So this is one legacy of Trotskyism, this orthodox understanding of Trotskyism as the transitional program, as permanent revolution, as first 4 congresses of the Communist International. This very reified, this packaged ideology that this is what Trotskyism is, right? So that's one understanding of Trotskyism. There's a historical understanding of Trotskyism, or in some sense, there's a much more accurate understanding of Trotskyism, which is, what was the historical function of Trotskyism? If Trotsky described the historic role of fascism was to crush the working class organization, then we can we can say that in some sense Trotsky was right, in the sense that we've been living in 100 or 80 plus years of fascism, in the sense that we have no workers' movement today. We have no left. If in Trotsky's time there's a crisis of revolutionary leadership, today we no longer have. We no longer have a crisis of revolutionary leadership. We no longer have revolutionary leadership. We no longer have workers' parties. We no longer have even a workers' movement. In some sense, fascism really did succeed in crushing any sort of workers' organization. The historic function of fascism achieved. But in some sense, let's ask ourselves the question of what was the historic function of Trotskyism? What was Trotskyism? From a historical understanding of Trotskyism, we can understand Trotskyism as basically classical Marxism at its extremists. And what we mean by classical Marxism at its extremists is basically in some sense, the last surviving memory of organized Orthodox Marxism. And if people will remember in Lukács, what Lukács described as Orthodox Marxism is Marxism as this, as a disciplined adherence to historical dialectics. Trotskyism remains kind of, in some sense, Trotskyism remains classical Marxism at its extremist, or classical Marxism at its historical end, right? From the whole legacy of the First International to the legacy of the Fourth International, Trotskyism is the last surviving bit of classical Marxism before classical Marxism, in some sense, becomes morphed into this kind of third worldism, or this kind of Trotskyism is kind of this last idea of Marxism as this kind of revolutionary ideology based off the principles of the Enlightenment for a profound hope for a better world, to the latter legacy of Marxism that we have today, which is this kind of reactionary, romantic ideology of the oppressed based off the romantic despair of servitude, right? In Platypus, how we've framed Trotsky is we've framed Trotsky as kind of a second international radical, right? Or still walking on this historical understanding. In Platypus, we've described or we've framed Trotsky as a second international radical, along with Luxemburg and Lenin. In a sense, what Trotsky and Trotskyism expresses radical second international Marxism at its historical end, or at its strands, right? As it's framed out with the movement of history, right? So then there's finally how we understand Trotskyism and Platypus, which I'll describe as, I'll articulate it as a vanquished party, right? And what I mean by a vanquished party is, what's interesting about Trotskyism is surprisingly not what the orthodox Trotskyists take to be interesting about Trotskyism. That is, its positive, or its positivistic conceptions, or its positive ideas of what is to be done. Rather, in Platypus, how we take up Trotskyism is the fact that it asks the question of what can be done. Right, and that's a very different question from what is to be done, right? What can be done? What are the revolutionary opportunities that are here? What are the revolutionary opportunities that are being squandered, right? Trotskyism very much is a negative politic, right? Or Trotskyism during the interwar period was very much a negative politic. And what I mean by a negative politic is not, in some sense, I'm not trying to describe it as a reactionary politic, but it is a politics of negation. It is a politics trying to negate social democracy, Stalinism, fascism, bourgeois nationalism. It's a politic of negation. It's a politic that is responding. It is a politic that is trying to, in some sense, show the potential or show the imaginations of what was earlier in the century. In some sense, Trotskyism in the 1930s is trying to hold up the memory of the 1890s, of the 1900s, of the 1910s against what would later be the 1940s, the 1950s, and the 1960s. What's interesting in Platypus is that Trotskyism was dialectical, but the latter legacy of Trotskyism is that it actually, or the latter legacy of Trotskyists, is that they dissolved the dialectic. Specifically, the dialectic that I'm talking about, that Trotskyism raises, is the dialectic between the USSR and the Soviet Union and Stalinism, of this idea of the Soviet Union as this revolution, or as something that is revolutionary, that shows the world of what it can be, versus the bureaucratic degeneration, which is Stalinism, right? This contradiction between Stalinphilia and Stalinphobia, between let me think what else, right? Between, in some sense, Stalinphilia, Stalinphobia, so the Soviet Union and the bureaucracy, and its own bureaucracy of, in some sense, the both the revolutionary potential of Marxism, but also its the regression that also occurs within Marxism, right? Trotskyism in some sense expresses kind of a continued crisis within Marxism. In Platypus, we take up Trotskyism as a problematic rather than a solution, or as a response to this answer. This is why I'll frame Trotskyism as a vanquished party, as a question regarding whether what Trotskyism sought to overcome Stalinism, or overcome the historical regression of Marxism. And once again, what do we mean when we say regression in Platypus? When we talk about regression in history, we're talking about repetition under worse forms, right? Trotskyism was supposed to be a response to this. Had we continued the syllabus, we would have later read Walter Benjamin's, on the concept of history. When Walter Benjamin talks about, in some sense, brushing history against the grain, this is what he talks about. When Walter Benjamin talks about brushing history against the grain, he's not talking about, he's talking about, in some sense, if we read history as a history of the victors, he's not saying we should read history from the vantage point of the victims, but rather the vanquished. The vanquished is a very different category from the victims, because though the vanquished are also victims, the difference is the vanquished actually had a struggle. The vanquished could have won, right? The vanquished had a possibility. In a sense, even though Trotskyism failed, Trotskyism remains real by its unfulfilled potential. This is what it means to talk about Trotskyism as a vanquished party. So I guess the very last thing I'll say as kind of like just an ending to all these lectures is just well, I'll frame it like this, right? What's the point of talking about this kind of like esoteric, unfulfilled history? In some sense, it's like, oh, is this just, there's a question here which is, oh, are we just preserving some like niche historical facts? Are we just an antiquarian society? And it's like, no. The reason why we talk about this history, the reason why we, in some sense, investigate this history, is not because, or it's not in some sense, just for the sake of knowledge, right? Knowledge must serve life. We talk about this history because the thing about politics is politics is fundamentally historical. It's because one's account of history is their theory of how the present came to be, and history is always a political act of how one talks about history. Because let me actually make a much more concise point. Let me make a concise point and specifically talk about Trotskyism. Today, it might seem that talking about Trotskyism is just kind of obscure and niche because Trotskyism historically was Trotskyism was understood as in the last century as a question regarding the leadership between Stalin versus Trotsky, right? At first glance, this feels like it's an issue just concerning the politics of one country, right? But as I hope this entire syllabus would show, it's like, no, this was not a question of one country, it was a question regarding the world. And why was it a question of the world? Because communists sought to, in some sense, revolutionize the world. So Trotskyism and Stalin, the Soviet Union was not a national question, it was a question regarding, could there have been a communist international, or could there have been a worldwide communist revolution? That's one thing. But two, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, it might seem that Trotskyism, Stalinism, both of these are just irrelevant, right? They both are non-existent today. So why does it matter? Well, here's the thing. The thing about questions and problems is even just because certain historical problems are past, that doesn't mean just because certain historical objects are gone, that doesn't mean that necessarily they've been digested, because that which has not been digested theoretically still lingers around, but in a much more obscure form. So, in some sense, the reason why we still talk about the history and legacy of 1917 is because 1917 still haunts us. The fact that there still exists a left today, the fact that there still exists, socio-political movements that organize themselves on a Leninist basis, on a communist basis, on a Marxist or socialist basis, despite these politics being of the past, right? The purpose of talking about this history in some sense is to recover these problems in their original articulations, because with any sort of study of history, it will be found out that many of the issues that happen today are repetitions of problems in the past, but they're usually much more clear the first time around than they are in the latter way. In some sense, the discussion of this history is to recover a past, to understand that past in a much more clearer light, to understand problems today. So the question of Trotskyism, or the problematic of Trotskyism in some sense, is still this question of how do we deal with the Stalinism of today, right? Or how do we deal with this kind of continued regression of the left today, of this continued lowering of horizons of Marxism today, by returning to the original lowering of horizons within Marxism. With that said, I guess thank you all for sticking around. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for engaging with this reading group thus far. This ends our Revolutionary Marxism lecture.